Hello again, guys. We are back. Just wanted to again say thank you for spending your afternoon with us. We have with us for this next 30 minutes or so, Kevin Henderson. Kevin Henderson's one of the senior associates. I hope I'm pronouncing that title right for you, Kevin. For Baker Bots. Baker Bots is an organization out of Dallas, Texas, and deal with all levels of legalities, as well as what I thought there were nonprofit attorneys. He helped me understand that there is no such title, but there are attorneys that can consult on various needs of a local church or an organization traveling abroad or domestic. And so I'll pass it to you, Kevin, and just let you do a little bit of intro about yourself, and then we can get into some of the content around on missions.
Sure. Thanks for the intro, and certainly appreciate being part of the conference and having a few minutes to spend with you all. I'm going to try and share some PowerPoint slides here really quickly and can walk through that way, sort of an introduction and a framework and a handful of things that I thought would be helpful to talk about today, followed by hopefully some time left over for some Q&A.
Perfect.
Brief.
Hey, Kevin, I think we lost your sound.
Yeah, I think Kevin's connection is a little. Kevin, do we have you there?
You do. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, you cut out there for the beginning half of that. We just saw you share your screen. It seems like the internet's a little spotty.
My apologies. Let me know if it breaks out again. But
yeah, I take it from the top.
Sure. So by way of brief introduction, I'm a corporate lawyer based out of Dallas at a firm called Baker Bots. As Jared mentioned, nonprofit law, you may occasionally find some specialists in that area, but generally nonprofits are no different than any other organization or corporation, other than the fact that they usually have some sort of social mission or bottom line, so to speak, other than profit. But usually lawyers like myself will consult with nonprofits just in the same way we will with, our for-profit clients, and oftentimes on a pro bono basis. So, as a start on legal matters, it's important to know that you shouldn't hesitate to reach out to those in the legal community, whether you know them or not, because they are oftentimes more than willing to donate their time and resources and hours to help nonprofits in their missions, particularly when it's a mission that they are aligned with. So someone in your faith community or local community, you should feel free to reach out, and they can oftentimes help. I, for one, work in the Dallas market, as I mentioned, with Baker Bots. We're a large international firm representing Fortune 100 clients all the way, down to local startup clients on a wide range of matters. That includes a number of local and national, international nonprofits. I'll skip by my bio and really launch right into the meat of what I wanted to talk about. There are really a couple of key considerations that I think are important to keep in mind when planning a mission trip. And they really fall into two categories. One is the tax side, which is the side that understandably makes a lot of people nervous, but perhaps a side that makes people equally as nervous, but sometimes more so out of ignorance than anything, is liability and the potential that you could become or be held responsible for something that happens on a trip that you're on. So I want to talk about those two areas in particular, and then maybe a handful of sort of good practices or recommendations, things to think about as you put together trips and plan trips with your communities, and some areas that, if you do reach out to a lawyer in your local community, even on a pro bono basis, hopefully this gives you some language and questions and things to think about, to kind of formulate a discussion and hopefully get some good advice to help you along the way. So let's start with tax. Sort of the elephant in the room, always comes up with lots of questions. And this really gets at the heart of how a mission trip is paid for. And that really breaks down into two primary buckets from a tax perspective. There are expenses that are personally incurred by the person going on the mission trip. And then there are donations or expenses of third parties. And there's some nuance there that I want to talk about in a minute. But let's start with travel expenses of the missionary. There are a couple of key considerations in order to make those expenses tax deductible. The first main area is that the expense be an unreimbursed expense. In other words, the person doing the traveling actually incurs the expense personally. So if I'm going to travel on a trip and I buy my own plane ticket, but then the organization I'm traveling with reimburses me for that plane ticket, I can no longer claim a deduction on my taxes for that travel, because it was reimbursed to me by the organization. So it's important to delineate between what you're reimbursing those who travel with you on these trips and helping those who are traveling understand that if they want to make personal deductions and claims on their taxes, that can only be done for expenses that they actually incur. And even then, there are certain limitations that are important to be aware of. And these are discussions that may be helpful to have with your groups and organizations as you're getting ready to travel. The first big area where there is some confusion is that the IRS actually will disallow a personal travel expense deduction for a nonprofit purpose if there's any sort of, and I'm going to put this in air quotes, substantial personal pleasure derived from the trip. Now, obviously, you hope that those who are traveling with you are having a good time and deriving personal pleasure from the work that you're doing in traveling around the world. That's not what they're getting at. What they're getting at is that if you go on a 2-week trip and you spend 10 days doing mission work and then 3 or 4 days at the beach touring the country and doing tourist activities, the actual folks traveling on the trip are no longer allowed to deduct their travel expenses because the IRS is going to assume that the travel expenses they incurred, hotels, flights, airplane, and lodging, etc., they're going to allocate that to the personal pleasure portion of the trip, and for better or for worse, say that the mission aspect of the trip was incidental. So that's important to keep in mind as you're planning your itinerary and helping folks understand that if there's going to be any sort of kind of personal vacation element, they may no longer be able to claim deductions of their own personal expenses. The other important thing that comes up here is that the expense has to actually be incurred by the taxpayer making the deduction. And the way that this is going to come up is particularly in a trip with youth, because you're going to have parents who are going to pay travel expenses directly for their son or child and then expect that they can claim a tax deduction. But the IRS actually doesn't view it that way. Even though there's a familial relationship, they're going to view the parent as a third party. In other words, the person doing the traveling isn't the taxpayer making the deduction. It's a third party trying to make the deduction, and that's not going to be allowed, and is another area that's important to help those in your communities understand, and I'll explain why as we move into the second portion, which is donations by third parties. This is really the area where you all listening into this conference are probably fielding questions and trying to understand how how you can respond appropriately to those going on your trips. There are a few things to keep in mind with donations by third parties in order to make them tax deductible, and whether or not you have any obligations to provide any sort of tax receipt or tax statement. The first one is an easy one. Generally, the donation has to be made to a qualified charitable organization. Churches and houses of faith in the US are automatically deemed charitable organizations. So whether or not they're formally registered as a 501c3, if it's a church organization, you meet that prong. So that's an easy one. Where it becomes difficult and hard to understand and navigate is the second issue, that is that the donation needs to be unrestricted, or in other words, non-targeted. So what does that mean? That means that if I'm sending my son on a mission trip and I go to my church and make a donation of $500 to cover travel expenses, etc., and say this money is to be used for my son's travel expenses, that is a restricted donation. It's targeted for an individual or one expense, and my instruction is to not use it for any other expense. That is actually disallowed as a charitable deduction by the IRS and would not be deductible. In order for the donation by a third party to be deductible, it has to be fully unrestricted. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't express some wish. They can write on the form, this money is being donated, to XYZ church, intended to cover the travel expenses of, John Doe, my son. That's fine, and you are perfectly fine as an organization to honor those wishes, so long as you are in fact retaining full discretion over the funds. The easiest way to deal with that is to include on the donation form, and I should pause there, that's point number one, you should have a donation form. You shouldn't just accept a check and go deposit it with a memo line that says for John Doe's travel expenses. You should actually have that donation be given to you together with a donation form that has some text somewhere on that form saying that while you may use every effort to utilize the funds as, in accordance with the wishes of the donor, the organization nonetheless retains full discretion over the expense of funds. And that's an important piece to make those donations tax deductible in order to put donors on notice that they have no right or entitlement to reimbursement of the funds. So if John Doe ends up getting sick and can no longer travel on the mission trip, they can't get that money back. They can't go to the organization and say, hey, my son's not going, I really need my $500 back. If that's the way it's handled, that is a signal that the organization doesn't have full unrestricted discretion over the funds and makes it a non-deductible donation. So it's really important to ensure that folks who are making any payments or donations on behalf of other third-party travelers, that they do so with full knowledge and understanding that while you will do everything you can to use the funds in accordance with their wishes, the discretion is retained by the organization to use the funds for any other charitable purpose. To kind of put a finer point on that, I just want to reiterate that the context this will come up most often is a parent-child or other family member, grandparent-grandchild scenario. And it's important to help them understand that if they want to claim a deduction, they should not pay any of the expenses directly. They should donate the money to the organization and let the organization pay the expense. If they donate to the organization, it will be tax deductible so long as it is unrestricted and the church, the organization retains discretion over the funds. As I stated earlier, if the parent or grandparent or aunt or uncle pays any expense directly, they lose their opportunity to get a deduction. I'll skip by the note for churches. I think I've already hit on that enough that you really need to make donors aware that you're retaining discretion over the funds, and then you should be fairly safe. Now, in terms of receiving donations, what are your obligations as an organization in order to help folks be able to claim the donation on their taxes? First and foremost, the responsibility falls to the individual donor. It may be helpful to remind them that they need to keep a written record of every charitable donation if they plan to deduct it on their taxes, no matter how small. If it's a $10 donation, they need to keep written record of that. It could be simple, it could be a bank statement or a receipt, but they need some written record. However, the IRS does impose obligations on the recipient organizations if the donation is greater than $250. And if the donation is greater than $250, and I should make clear that's in the aggregate in a calendar taxable year. So if they pay $50 a month for 12 months, that aggregates to $600 and this obligation is triggered. You have to provide a donation statement or acknowledgement of the donations. That acknowledgement needs to be received before the donor files their taxes. So a good rule of thumb is sometime in January of the following year, you should mail out a statement to anyone who donated for the mission trip, itemizing all the donations that you received on behalf of themselves or on behalf of any third party. And that letter should include a list of things. And I'll pause here for any of you taking notes. There is an IRS publication numbered 1771 that's actually quite user-friendly. It's not difficult to follow. It's drafted in fairly plain language, and it's only 7 or 8 pages long and kind of walks through in detail what an organization's obligations are and what information you need to provide to a donor. So you should feel free to just Google that IRS publication 1771 and give that a read, and that will reiterate a number of these issues that we're talking about here. Oh, my apologies, I'm skipping ahead. So what should the letter or acknowledgement include? Just to barrel through this quickly, it should include a statement of your tax-exempt status. It should identify the organization and the donor, so you should name your organization and the person who made the donation. It should include the date or dates, if it was multiple donations, of the contributions, and any details of what the contribution was. If that's money, it's simple. It's just a dollar figure, $60 on January 1st, $100 on February 24th, and so on. However, folks can donate goods, including on mission trips. You may imagine a mission trip that involves working in an orphanage, that someone wants to donate toiletries and clothing and other personal effects for the group or organization to take with you on your trip. Those donations of goods are in fact tax deductible, and you do have an obligation if their value approximates $250 or more to deliver this written acknowledgement statement. So if it's actual goods, personal effects that are donated, you should describe what those were, but do not describe an estimate of the value. That is left up to the taxpayer to estimate in good faith what the value of the goods donated were when they file taxes. So you aren't obligated to make any sort of good faith estimate or guess there. You just need to describe what it was. The last point is an important one, that you need to include a statement that says, as long as it's true, that no goods or services were provided by the organization to the donor in exchange for the contribution. That's an important statement, because if it's not true, if you as an organization do provide some goods or services in return for the donation, you need to describe what those are and an estimated value of what it's worth. So where does this come up in context? This would be if you host a fundraiser, say it's a pancake breakfast, where folks come and they buy a pancake breakfast and you put on this event, and they, you charge them $25 a head for a pancake breakfast. Well, that $25 donation was actually you as an organization provided goods and services in exchange for that $25 donation. So you need to describe that you provided a pancake breakfast in exchange for the donation with an estimated value of $5, $7, $10, whatever your good faith estimate is. And that needs to be included in that statement. So that's important to remember, a couple of important details there. And like I said, that IRS publication has this list in more detail that you can refer to for help in understanding what these statements should look like to the extent you don't have a form prepared and ready. That's it for the moment on taxes, and hopefully helpful in confronting questions as they come up from folks in your organizations and as you get ready to travel, but particularly for your own internal record keeping and in making sure that you comply with the rules that you need to in order to help folks make their donations tax deductible. So let's pivot for a minute to the other topic I wanted to hit on before we try and answer a couple of questions. And that is, what can you as an organization do to try and limit your exposure to potential liability during or after an event? There are a couple of areas where you can focus on documenting certain things in order to limit your exposure to someone being injured or having something else happen where you as an organization or you as an individual, and I'll get to that in a moment, could be held liable. The three main areas you want to focus on are assumption of risk forms, and these should be signed by anybody who travels on your trip. They should be as long as necessary. There's a concept in tort law, which is the area of law that this covers, called informed consent. And that doctrine says that an assumption or waiver of liability, assumption of risk, however you want to put it, is invalid and won't be recognized by a court if it isn't signed with informed consent by the person signing the form. So if they don't fully understand the extent of the potential liability or the risk that they're waiving, you run the risk of this assumption of risk and waiver form not being held up in court if it's challenged by someone who gets hurt. So what does informed consent look like? Well, as I said, this form should be as long as necessary and should outline all the potential risks that you can reasonably think of that may be encountered on this trip. And that's going to be highly fact specific. That's not necessarily something a lawyer can help you with. You need to really do your legwork and putting in some thought and research on what the risks of the locations are, the activities that you're going to be engaged in, etc. And those risks should be clearly outlined in this assumption of risk form in order to document that when the individual signs this form, they had informed consent. They understood the exposure to risk that they were signing up for. Within those forms, another important issue, and this can vary by state, so it may be important to have this portion reviewed by a lawyer in the state where you operate, but the actual provisions of these forms where you're releasing the organization from liability, I say you, I mean where an individual is releasing an organization from liability, needs to be conspicuous. And that has been interpreted by many courts across the country to mean exactly how it looks on the screen, that it needs something to stand off the page and kind of jump out and draw the attention of the person signing the form. That could be a paragraph that's all bold or underlined, all caps, or something to make it look different than the rest of the text in the form. If it's just buried in a paragraph that looks like anything else and they're waiving all claims and liabilities of any kind since the dawn of time, you run the risk of a court looking at and saying, no, that wasn't conspicuous enough. We're not going to uphold this waiver of liability, and we are indeed going to hold the organization liable. So that's an important point to remember. The final point on assumption of risk forms, only adults can assume risk by contract on behalf of themselves. Children can't legally enter into a binding agreement, so having a child sign a contract is not legally enforceable. And furthermore, the child's parents can't actually assume risks on behalf of the children. So that's important to understand as we move to the second form, which is a parental consent, anytime that youth are involved in a mission trip. While parents can't actually assume risks, they can consent to the participation of their children in risky activities. And that consent is important consent to have and can help limit your liability in much the same way that a full assumption of risk and waiver of liability form can. Again, this is very fact specific and gets back to informed consent, and you want to be sure to fully disclose all the risks that you can think of based on your due diligence of the activity and location in order to provide that informed consent. This is one area, particularly with children, where you should definitely, even if you can't find an attorney pro bono, you may want to consider setting aside some small set of funds to have an attorney review, because parental consent forms are very fact specific and vary significantly by state law. So there's no really good universal form. You need something that works in your location. And I would highly encourage, if on no other subject, at least here, you try and seek legal counsel. The final form, I'll just hit it quickly. You're probably familiar with it, is a medical authorization. Again, while minors are involved, you want the parents to provide some designated adult or individual on the trip to make emergency medical decisions if the parent can't be reached. That is a fairly standard form. You can find examples online if you don't have one, or ask other organizations, or even your insurance carriers will oftentimes have forms that they'll provide for you. But that's an important form to have for every minor who travels with you on a mission trip. So that's the documentation. There are other areas that I'll hit on before we try and answer a few questions where you may be exposed to liability. And these are the two biggest areas, and that is negligence and different forms of negligence. The two key areas where you could be held liable, and you may have heard stories of other churches or organizations being sued by travelers who are injured or have something else happen. Those claims generally fall under one of these two buckets, and that is negligent supervision and negligent hiring. Negligence as a legal matter really is a doctrine that imposes on those who have a duty to do something. It imposes a standard that is a reasonable, an objectively reasonable person. What would an objectively reasonable person do in the situation? Couple of areas of key concern for mission trips is a duty to warn. You can heighten your obligation and duty to warn of dangers and known issues based on your superior knowledge. If you've traveled to this location before and are aware of certain issues in this location, and you don't disclose that to the travelers, or if minors, to their parents, then this gets back to the issue of implied consent, and it opens you to a claim of negligent supervision, that you weren't adequately training and warning those under your supervision with the risks that they could be exposed to on your trips. You also want to be very careful to avoid misrepresentations. One of the ways that this comes up often in contexts like mission trips is representations, whether direct or implied, that you are going to do something or guarantee something that you aren't going to do or can't guarantee. For example, you should avoid statements to folks like, no harm will come to your son or daughter on this trip. if you make statements like that and they're taken as true, and parents entrust their children to you because you have represented that you're going to ensure that no harm comes to them, and then they break their leg, you may have just opened yourself to a claim that you misrepresented how closely you're going to be supervising these youth while on a mission trip. You can imagine a number of other scenarios where this could come up, but that doesn't mean that you need to be a downer when talking to folks and just constantly, horrible things could happen. I just want everyone to be aware. But you do just want to be careful not to overstate. You want people to understand, look, we're traveling to, pick your place, South America, where, we're going to do everything we can to keep your kids safe and treat them as if we were our own kids. But there are potential risks and concerns that you need to be aware of and talk to your child about. That's the type of conversation that avoids these sorts of misrepresentation claims where you wave things off saying, oh no, we're going to do everything and ensure that no harm or accident will fall. The second area is duty to give care. This can also fall under the negligent supervision. Generally, the law doesn't require third parties to render any sort of care or medical care. If you pass someone in the street that's hurt, you're under no obligation to stop and help that person legally. Morally, we can have a different discussion, but legally, you're under no obligation. That's different in the case of a controlling relationship. So where you have supervisory authority over folks, you have opened yourself to a duty to actually render care and help ensure that those under your supervision receive the care that they need. And that's important to keep in mind. Again, remembering this objective third-party standard. Is it objectively reasonable to waive off the complaint of someone traveling with you that their sides hurt? That could be a signal that they are coming down with appendicitis. A reasonable third person may not waive that off. And if you just let it go and say, oh, you're just complaining, you may find yourself open to a negligent supervision claim that you didn't give adequate care when someone needed it. So it's always helpful to be conservative anytime any sort of injury, complaint, illness, sickness, those are the areas where while you're traveling with folks under your supervision, you want to be err on the side of caution and be more conservative than not, so you don't open yourself up to a claim that you were negligent in taking care of someone and their needs. The last area here is negligence in hiring. That sounds a little bit weird, but that is the legal doctrine, negligent hiring, but it applies equally to anybody in a quote unquote agency relationship, someone who is acting as an agent for the organization. So that does cover volunteers, not just paid employees that are hired for a wage. Negligent hiring, where does this come up? This depends a lot on the circumstances and degree of responsibility of the person. It may be, for example, it may be reasonable, again, remembering this reasonable third-party standard, a reasonable third party would, for example, check adult volunteers who have day-to-day supervisory contact with youth on a mission trip against a sex offender registry, for example. Conversely, if you're just hiring the charter company who's going to drive the bus with your group to the airport, well, it may not be totally reasonable to find out that person's identity and check them against a sex offender registry. So this is a facts and circumstances exercise. You want to understand the degree of responsibility over the people, who are the people they have responsibility over, and then give some thought to what's reasonable here to make sure that I'm not negligent in choosing who I'm going to hire or ask to be a volunteer with authority over those who are entrusted to your care. At a minimum, that means any volunteers you take with you on a trip should undergo a background check. They're fairly inexpensive. There are a number of companies that will do them and do them relatively quickly, but background checks are kind of a a minimum that a court will look at and say, look, you had a volunteer that you took on this trip for 3 weeks with youth to Central America, and you didn't even do a background check to find out they had been convicted of, felony XYZ 5 years earlier. They're going to find you negligent in selecting that volunteer to travel with you. So at a minimum, background checks, and from there, you may add additional steps you take to ensure that you are selecting the right people, selecting safe people, and protecting yourself against a negligent supervision claim. That might be reference checks. It might be, cultural sensitivity training if you're going to an area of foreign country and different cultures, and ensuring that your volunteers understand what's sensitive in that culture, etc. So give some thought to what a reasonable organization would do to ensure that they are hiring or selecting the right volunteers. Finally, and I'll put a pin here and see if there are any questions in the last few minutes we have together. And I apologize for speaking at you for so long, but I think these are important points to discuss. The last point is that not only can your organization be open to liability, something to keep in mind is that individual leaders may also be subject to liability on these same theories of, negligent supervision, negligent hiring. If the court finds that they've committed, quote unquote, gross negligence, that's a higher standard than mere negligence. It's not just a reasonable third-party standard. It's, call it, and I have here in the subtext, a serious failure to act responsibly. Gross negligence would be letting a group of 14-year-olds go out alone in Bogota, Colombia at night to go night clubbing. Definitely not something a reasonable person would do, but also something that folks might view as a more heightened, a serious failure to act responsibly. And if something was to happen to one of those 14-year-olds while they're out in a foreign country, late at night, going to nightclubs, you have just subjected yourself individually on a personal level to a claim that you've committed gross negligence. So it's important that those of you responsible for these trips take care to ensure that, again, you're selecting the right people to supervise, you're supervising properly, you've always got this threshold in your mind, what would a reasonable person be doing in these circumstances, and always err on the side of being more conservative than not. And that will generally keep you outside of this area of gross negligence and at least insulate you from a personal level so that you don't end up in a really tricky situation. But it's important to keep in mind. That's really it on liability. Good practices, maybe spend 30 seconds here. One area particularly where youth are involved, consider whether you want to impose a media policy or a media release, particularly if you're in a foreign country. You may want to control where the kids are taking pictures of themselves and tagging themselves so that bad actors can't see, oh, here's a group of Americans checking in at this hotel in El Salvador that can create a dangerous situation. So consider media policy as well as a media release from the parents or adults traveling with you, just to ensure that you don't have any issues or complaints where you as an organization take a picture or video and post it on your own organization's public YouTube channel or Facebook page. So that's an area to think about. Insurance, you may consider getting health insurance, particularly traveling overseas, or at least recommending that individuals look into doing it. Most domestic policies won't cover. You also may want to look into, if you're traveling to a place that may be dangerous or have other issues, you may look into other forms of insurance, and this gets back to those negligence standards. If you're traveling to a place where it's known that Americans may be kidnapped, for example, you may want to look into hostage-related insurance or things like that. Now, I understand most of you are small organizations, and that may be cost prohibitive, but it's something to keep in mind and something that may inform the areas where you're looking at going on mission trips. But know that products like that are available, and if it seems to fit your circumstances, you may give it some thought. And then again, consider screening participants. This gets back to the negligent supervision to make sure that you understand what your heightened duties as a supervisor, particularly of youth on a mission trip. You'll want to understand: are you taking someone who has asthma or some other health condition? Consider having them get a physical exam and letting you know what their health problems are. Verification of insurance to make sure they're properly insured. Whether you have the right approvals and whether they're willing to assume the risks, focusing on that informed consent. Have background checks been conducted? That's important for travelers on mission trips, not just the volunteers who are supervising the trips. If you are taking a group of adults, you may consider doing background checks of the adults traveling with you to ensure that you don't have any surprises of a bad actor who's part of your volunteer group, not just your supervisors. And then when minors are involved, for the leaders, again, consider background checks, reference checks, and actually check them. Try and understand their previous work with children, etc. Just some good practices to help insulate that liability. I think I'll cut off there. I think we only have a couple of minutes. Maybe there's one or two questions I could try and answer. International travel considerations, there's not much to talk about here other than maybe if you're going to a foreign country, realize that many people don't know that you can register with a consulate in the country, so that they're aware that you are there, who's there, where you're at, how long you're going to be there, particularly if it's a country that has historically been subject to any sort of civil unrest, that you can let them know in advance that you've got a group that's going to be in the country, so that they know they have Americans in the country, who you are, where you are, and how to find you in the event that any issues or problems come up. Hopefully that was helpful. I don't know if we have any more time. Maybe I'll defer to Jared whether or not we have a minute or two left to answer any questions, or if there are any questions.
We do indeed. So thank you. My goodness, that was fantastic. I can't tell you how many requests and emails I'm getting. Real quick, is this deck something that could be available to be shared?
Yeah, I'm happy to provide it to you, Jared, and leave it to you with who to farm it out to, and whoever requests a copy. You're more than welcome to review it. I will caveat and say I forgot to give my typical disclaimer that lawyers are famous for at the start, but just realize this is general information. Laws vary by state and certainly by country, so this should be kind of taken in the spirit it's intended, which is informative but not legal advice. And if you have kind of more pointed questions, it'll be important to find someone that's a specialist in your state to try and understand exactly what the legal considerations are there. But with that understanding, I have no problems making this available.
Thank you so much. We actually have one question in relation to how it works within Focus Missions, and to highlight Rebecca's question: how is the tax deduction non-restricted category working with Focus Missions, since it appears that you are supported a specific person and there's no verbiage for the IRS? And so what we'll actually, I think we've probably got two feature enhancements on Focus Missions that I know of out of this conversation. So I believe this is in regards to the donation page. So we, in our functionality, provide a landing page, almost like a GoFundMe style operation. And I believe what she's saying is those funds can be used for the purpose of the organization or of the trip. And I don't think we have a prefacing statement for that. That is one area that we'll absolutely come back on, Rebecca, and I want you to be able to, we'll circle back to that, because that is definitely within the compliance that Kevin shared with us. Are there any other questions? I mean, you covered so much there. That was fantastic. Thank you for taking your time. And I don't see any more questions populating. Again, there's definitely an availability if you would like to reach out to BakerBots. You saw that on the first home screen. Is it bakerbots.com?
It is, yeah, bakerbots.com, and you can just put right in the search bar there my name if you want to drop me a line and see if it's something I can help answer. Particularly if you're in Texas, I'm happy to chat for a few minutes. Yeah, that's how you can find me.
Well, thank you. That was as in-depth. I was just fantastic. I have no backing in law, obviously. And it was extremely digestible and extremely enlightening. That was on the comment section and the emails that I'm receiving, definitely the most chatter that we've had. So extremely entertaining, extremely valuable. Thank you so much, Kevin. And we're just going to go on break till it will be 5 Central. We'll be starting back up, so in the next 13 minutes here. And we'll be starting with David Welch of Liberty University, as well as David with Christian Aid Mission. So we'll check back with you in a couple minutes, and we'll be all on hold screens until then. Thank you so much, and thank you again, Kevin.
Thank you.